So now we're going to take time and look at part 2 of 7 of our Theological Foundations. We did the first one back in November on poverty, and then we had the devotions over the next month and a half on that theme. And now we're moving on to our second one. Some of you are going, didn't we just do this last year? Yeah, you're right. However, as we were looking at the schedule and as we were looking at how to do this, we revamped everything back in April and May and June and decided that we will repeat this image of God part of our teaching, partly because it is so significant. This is really the base of, if we call the other ones the foundation, this is the base of the foundation. And on top of that, we also have some new staff that didn't hear it the first time. And quite bluntly, I've had a year to think about it. And so I revamped that first paper and made some changes and moved things around to different other topics. And so even if you think you've heard it, there's going to be all kinds of new stuff that you're going to hear this morning too. So bear with me as we work through all this. You have the one-page summary there on your chair. That's in case you get bored or you want to pass the quiz that we're going to do at the end. Everything's there. But we want to start off, and hopefully you had a chance to watch some of the different quotes that we put on the screen earlier on before we started today. C.S. Lewis, one of the quotes that was there was from C.S. Lewis. He says, "There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal." Isn't that beautiful? There are no ordinary people. Oh, here at YSM, right from our website, it states there, one of our statements, that the Yonge Street Mission is called to demonstrate God's love, peace, and justice to people living with economic, social, and spiritual poverty in Toronto. As a not-for-profit Christian faith community, we acknowledge that every person is created in the image of God and has inherent value and dignity. This is right at the very start of naming for anybody who wants to know more about Yonge Street Mission. This gives them a very clear perspective on where we're coming from, why we do the things that we do, this motivation, this drive, this philosophy, this inner core of who we are, that we acknowledge every person to be created in the image of God and therefore has this inherent value and dignity. Now, sometimes in the paper, we use the term Imago Dei. Part of me wanted to take that out and just put in an image of God. For those of you who've taken French, you know that Dei or Deo or Dieu is the same word for God. Imago, obviously, is just Latin for image. And I decided to leave it in simply because I think that term lifts it up and raises it a little bit higher, and it sticks in our mind. And so sometimes if you hear me use Imago Dei as opposed to image of God, it's they're the same thing. I just want to make sure that we recognize just how important this is by giving it a slightly different take. Also in our Articles of Faith and Doctrine that you sign every year in agreement, says there that all people are created in the image and likeness of God. Every one of us has value and dignity and is full of promise and unique potential. And so now we're going to go through all this and see, is this really what we believe? Is this really what we hold to? And if so, how does it impact what we do? First, 2 quick stories, both from last winter, right about this time. And so I ran into one of our daycare workers going into Starbucks. We grabbed our coffee. We're coming back, and there's this guy sprawled out on the street, an old, filthy, unkept gentleman. And he had a walker, and so we helped him get up. And then he was sitting on his walker, and we were just waiting to make sure he was okay. And he looked me directly in the eye and said, "Thank you." And then it was weird because then he kept staring in my eyes. And I couldn't take my eyes off him because he had the most beautiful eyes I've ever seen. Like, just gorgeous. And I can't think of any other way to describe it, but I almost felt like I was actually looking in the eyes of Jesus. 2 days later, I'm up at Parliament and and bluer and crossing the street there. And I heard a voice call out to me. At least I didn't know they're calling me. They didn't know me by name. So I turned around, and there behind me was this big, strong, fit-looking stranger around 30. And as soon as I turned around, he started cursing me and threatening me and raising his fist to hit me, although he didn't. Just while we were crossing the street, and I'm going, okay, obviously there's some mental issues here or something going on. And when I looked at him in the eyes, he had two of the craziest and wildest eyes I've ever seen. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he disappeared. He was gone. My reflection on that is that both the old gentleman with these beautiful eyes and this other guy with the crazy eyes, both have the image of God stamped in them. That they are both human. So discussing this Imago Day is to ask the question, what does it mean to be human? What is it that makes us distinct from the rest of creation? Is it our genetics? Is it the physical distinctives? Is it the human consciousness, our mind, the ability to reason? Is it the ability to come up with complex communication? Is it the ability to express a wide variety of emotions with a special emphasis on that of love? Is it the ability to express creatively through the imagination and the arts? Is it the capacity for sharing through relationships that are beyond just a simple drive for survival? Or is it this awareness of being spiritual? All of these come together to help us to understand this being made in the image of God, that there's something that's different, that's something that makes us different from the rest of creation. It then challenges us to think about the value of life. Now, for those that stop to think about the value of life, or those that listen to the various reports in the news, it's one thing to have this higher consciousness that we recognize the sacredness of life, but do we extend that to the whole species? If you take this body, you take out all the minerals that are there, it's worth about $1. All the trace minerals. Not very valuable from that perspective. But in recent years, there have been ethical questions being asked about the value of life. For instance, the selling of human organs for transplants. The discussion around abortion, euthanasia, genetic engineering, robotics, assisted suicide and death with dignity, slavery, abuse, healthcare, salaries, religious freedom, cloning, torture, death penalty, sexuality, stem cell research, data chip implants, organ donations, use of steroids, transplantation of human body parts to humans, compulsory vaccination, quarantine for infectious individuals, reproduction, sexual selection, having one child to save another, the use of humans for clinical trials, testing new treatments, devices, or drugs, and human testing on vulnerable populations in less developed countries. These are all ethical questions that make us think about what is the value of the human life. And what do we base our standards on? Do we use basic cultural norms? Do we go on our feelings? Do we go on experiences? Do we go on our religious beliefs? Well, if we're Christians, we start our understanding through the Scriptures, through the Bible. And so it becomes one of our primary sources of wisdom that guides our understanding of truth. And within its pages, we discover what God is like. And when we discover what God is like, we discover what we are like, because we have this image. And if we can determine the characteristics of God, then as creatures being made like God, we can discover who we are. And we start because in Genesis chapter 1, I think God put the creation story, and in particular the parts that talk about us being made in God's image, right there in the very first chapter, in the very first page, because God knew that whenever somebody opened up the Bible, they probably turned to the first page and would read it. And may not get past the first page for whatever reason. At least they got the this core message that we are made in the image of God. I also think, by the way, that he put Revelation in the back, hoping that nobody would ever get to it. And unfortunately, some of us did. But that's off topic. God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, God created them. So the word there for humankind is Adam. That's the Hebrew word. There's no gender distinction. It's only applied as a name, Adam, that we use today, when the is put in front of it, the article. And a few items worth highlighting about the use of this word Adam in this particular passage are, first of all, that humankind are the only ones of the created order that were declared to be made by God in the form of God's likeness. Secondly, they were given power over all the rest of the created order. Thirdly, they were given the command to be fruitful and multiply. Obviously, we've done that well. It is only after humankind are created that God declares all of creation not just good, but when it comes to humans, God states, very good. Probably with a smile. Fifthly, they were specifically described as being made or formed from the earth, the dust, the soil, the mud. Another way of translating that word is rubbish. That God has taken the most common thing and shaped and molded it into something special. Humankind were the only ones mentioned as being given life by God breathing into them. That word breath, ruah, is spirit. Humankind were the only species described as being made male and female, inferring that they're created both to be both sexual and that they are to be in social relationships. The description of the creation of humans, as found in these first two chapters, deals with the very uniqueness of who we are. This is not a scientific study, but rather it's written in the genre of prose. And it's to express not the scientific understanding of how God did it, but why God did it. Because God is a God who looks for relationship. In Genesis chapter 2:7, it says, Then the Lord God formed human from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. The wording here demonstrates a tenderness and a beauty that God puts into the creation of humans. It's here that we find this indefinable sacredness from which the dignity for human life derives its worth and value. That God literally or figuratively put his hands in the mud and began to shape and mold that image and turning the commonness of this dirt into sacred soil. And then God breathes into human life, lip to lip. A rare display of intimacy and tenderness and affection. In the sharing of breath, almost like mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, the image is imparted. One of the writers said that at this moment, God passes on the gift of the soul. The next reference is in Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. It says, This is the list of the descendants of Adam. When God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them humankind when they were created. Now, this is significant because it takes place after chapters 3 and 4. In chapter 3, we have the record of Adam and Eve eating the fruit and disobeying God that we call, commonly referred to as the fall, when sin enters into the world. In chapter 4, we have the record of the first murder, the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain kills his brother, Abel. After all that has taken place, and some other people are listed in that section, after all that is done, the writer still says, but we're still made in the image of God. That in spite of sin entering into the world, into us, we still have the stamp, the image of God is still there within us. It is not lost. It is alive and well. The next passage is found a few chapters later in chapter 9 of Genesis, verses 5 and 6. It says, I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind. Now this is after the story of Noah and the flood. And Noah is offering as animal sacrifice, the first record of this taking place. And once again, God doesn't say no to the sacrifice of the animal, but he declares a sacredness of human life over and above all other forms of life. That God is, in a sense, stating that to take a human life is paramount to attacking God himself. Now, in those that have been taking time to record our understanding, what we call theology, how we understand God, there are some of those in history that have talked about that once the fall came, the image was lost, or the image was so marred and dirtied up by sin that we can't find it anymore. Rather, in chapters 5 and chapter 9, we have an affirmation that the image of God is still alive and well and continues on in spite of all the messiness of life, in spite of all the wrong that takes place. Last passage we're going to look at in the Old Testament is from Psalm 139. You all love this one because it makes us feel so good, and it should make you feel good. For it was you who formed my inward parts, referring to God. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. Now again, understand, this is written as poetry. It's not how. It's written to express this intimacy and this interconnectedness that we have with God, that God individually takes each person, and there in his little secret cave, with all little jars of all the different things that God could put in life, each one he thinks about and goes, I'm going to give this person that extroverted personality. And you can go through your Myers-Briggs and figure all this other stuff that he puts in there. The artistic ability, I was listening to Daniel play today when we were singing. The poetry, the words that we sang were amazing, but to stop and just listen to Daniel do a little fills, it's just beautiful. I can't do it. It's not in me. That wasn't one of the little extra things that God put in me. But I can enjoy and appreciate other people's gifts that God has made them in their special way. See, poetry is more about expressing feelings and emotions rather than fact and data. It is not necessarily answering the question how, and therefore should not be taken literally. But it does convey this intimacy and this personal involvement on the part of God, giving each one of us an individual life. That we are formed, knitted, made, woven. The tenderness and caring that God puts into each person, the sovereignty of God over each of our lives. And it's a continual process all throughout history. We can continue on, but you can read the 15 pages of the paper later. We'll email it to you so you can enjoy. But one of the keys there all throughout the Old Testament is that this is universal. This is for each one of us. This is for every single human being that has ever existed and will exist. The New Testament continues on in the same theme, but from a different perspective, because it talks about the incarnation, that God became human. God became flesh. And that there is found in every human, the value of every human, that God chose to become the Son of Man, Emmanuel, God with us. Paul writes, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for in Him all things in heaven and on earth were created. He Himself is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. He is the beginning, so that He might come to have the first place in everything. For in Him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. He, in this passage, is referring to Jesus Christ, that He is the image of the invisible God. Paul declares that the human person known as Jesus of Nazareth, the individual situated in time and place, known and seen by many, bears the truest image of God. Jesus Himself declared, Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Further, it says, In Him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. If we want to understand what it means to be fully human, it's important for us to begin to understand who Jesus is and how He lived His life and what He said and the actions and the expressions that He left with us so that we would understand further what it means to be fully human. And that He's come to renew us and restore the image of God in us. And that He's come to remove all the walls of separation where we want to put one level of humans above others. We want to dehumanize each other. Jesus has come to remove those walls. Colossians 3 verses 9 to 11 says, You have stripped off the old self with its practices and have clothed yourself with a new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its Creator. In that renewal, there is no longer Jew nor Greek, no difference in ethnicity. There is no difference in religion. There is no difference between circumcised and uncircumcised. There is no difference between barbarian and Scythian, slave and free. But Christ is all and in all. That Christ is all and in all. That He has died for all of humanity because of every life has that inestimable value. Every person of every gender, culture, creed, and station in life has complete dignity and is worthy of being treated with love, peace, and justice, as we declare at Yonge Street Mission. And Jesus, being both divine and human, embodied the human nature that was not to be despised as evil, but embraced as worthy of divine redemption. We're going to skip a couple of stories here, because I want to get to the best stuff, at least my opinion. Because that stuff is all good. That's what we believe, supposedly. It's sort of in the head, but how do we get it down here? And so let's talk about the implications for us and how we live this out. See, each one of us, what it does is having this understanding gives us the opportunity for the healing of our self-image. Each of us enters into the ministry at Yonge Street Mission bringing our own hurts and pains that we've experienced over our lifetime. While we come with the desire to help others discover who they are, we often are in the midst of our own journey of self-discovery. We have our memories of when we failed. We bear the scars that come from the experiences of rejection. Words of dismissal, insults on our being, and criticisms that pierce our ego all cause wounds that attack the frail dignity of our souls. For some of us, working among those who have experienced great brokenness brings us dangerously close to our own wounds. And whatever our own stories may be, we are all in need of reclaiming our own self-worth. Now let me digress just for a little bit. Jungian psychology. Yeah, what do I know about it? Not much. Like most of you, I took just enough psychology to be dangerous. However, I do remember Jungian psychology, found it fascinating, about the only thing I remember from most of what I studied in that area. Carl Jung didn't talk about the ego and the id and the superego the way Freud did. He talked about the self. Now, he's not coming from a Christian perspective. People want to make Carl Jung Christian. He never publicly declared any position of where he stood with God. But he states this. He says that self is a God image that is implanted within the psyche. This is Jung saying this. The self, the ego, as some might use, is a God image. And he stressed that the self is not God itself, but rather only an image of God, that is a portrayal of God as it would be represented within the psyche. And he says, to encounter yourself is like a religious experience. He says it's a religious experience with God that can leave us vitalized and enriched. This healing of self-discovery of who we are, that we have this image of God stamped within us, carries us through the day and gives us extra life, this vitalization and enrichment. So applying the Imago Day to one's own life story is the key for our inner healing. It restores our self-esteem or self-image from the inside out. Too often we look from the outside and try to restore our image by getting the pat on the back and by encouragement and by people complimenting us and by trying to prove our self-worth. Rather, this comes from the inside out, that we know whose we are. It protects us from the outside messages that try to deny us the right to our proper inheritance. Knowing that I am carrying the image of God within me gives my life infinite value. It can never be taken away from me. To be human is to be sacred. It is a gift of God, not earned, nor deserved, nor can it ever be removed from me. It is part of what we call the chara, or the grace, that amazing grace that God gives to every human. And it is the start, it's not the end, but it is the start of good news. Right? Now you can say amen finally. It is God telling us to see ourselves as the beloved. I don't know about you, that's good news. I can't help it. Serving the community around us then, the Imago Day has the power to change our vision if we allow it to first change our perception of ourselves so that we can begin to accept ourselves. Then that changes how we begin to respond to others. The second greatest commandment is this. You know it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these, Jesus said. We cannot fully love our neighbor until we begin to learn to love ourselves. When how we view ourselves begins to transform into truly loving oneself, then our love for neighbor becomes transformed. Boundaries and restrictions we place on others are removed. Our perception of the unlovable is reversed. Our definition of neighbor is enlarged. And is God telling us to see others also as the beloved? That we can now truly invite others to receive the inner healing that we ourselves are in the process of discovering. And this then begins to change in how we minister to others, that we demonstrate this love of God. And in turn, so going back to the passage in Colossians, where it says, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. If Christ is the image of the invisible God, then the way to see God is to see Jesus. And in turn, Jesus says that we will find him, we will recognize him among the least of our city. The hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, those in prison. Jesus says, if you do it unto the least of these, you did it to me. That seems to cover many of the people that come to YSM. The neglected child, the battered teenage girl, the violent young man in jail, the person off their meds acting bizarrely, the senior whose pension does not cover the most basic of monthly expenses, the family who have recently arrived in Canada and can't yet speak English. These are the least. These are the forgotten. In some ways, it is not so much them needing us as it is us needing them, because in them we discover further our humanness. Yet at some point we must stop and ask, who is revealing Jesus to whom? Could it be that in our desire to see the poor transformed, that we might actually miss out on seeing Jesus? There is no them or us. Everyone comes together to form community. Everyone has something to offer to community. Jean Vanier, one of the true Canadian heroes, says communities are truly communities when they are open to others, when they remain vulnerable and humble, when members are growing in love, in compassion, and in humility. Transforming not just us, transforming not just those that we serve, but also transforming YSM as what we call the faith community. That means that understanding of Imago Dei begins to change and influence our practices, such as our hiring practices, our diversity in leadership, the development of servant leadership, the respect for other Christian faith traditions, remembering to pray for one another, reconciliation at home, being a worshiping community, the demonstration of gratitude and celebrating our achievements together, all come from the basis of an understanding of Imago Dei. And lastly, it gives us an awareness of our unity in Christ. Last year, about this time, January 1st, Pope Francis prayed. He said that those from diverse religious traditions and all people of goodwill may work for peace. We do that because of the commonness of humanity. That all people are together. That we all deserve the right for this value of life and dignity and peace and justice. We as staff, we come from diverse denominations, but if we have Imago Dei as our foundation, it provides us with a perspective that shifts our focus from what separates us and divides us to that which unites us. Each co-worker carries on the image of God, and each volunteer carries the image of God and is uniquely equipped by God for good works. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other. Just as the Lord has forgiven you, so also you must forgive. And above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony.